The American campaign to starve Japan into submission failed not because the blockade was incomplete, but because the strategic premise required a version of Japan that had never existed. The assumption embedded in Operation Starvation that an island nation dependent on maritime imports could be forced into collapse through interdiction, misread dependency as fragility. What appeared as vulnerability was the surface expression of an economic model that had spent 80 years preparing for exactly this scenario. The question is not why Japan survived the mining of its coastal waters in 1945, but why American planners believed starvation was achievable against a state whose entire modern existence had been constructed around the expectation of resource denial. Pause. Shift slightly into historical explanation. The structural origin lies in the 1868 Meiji Restoration, which established national survival as an administrative problem requiring permanent solutions. Japan possessed no coal reserves adequate for industrialization, no oil fields, no rubber plantations, no significant iron ore deposits. The architects of Meiji modernization understood that every calorie of imported fuel and every ton of imported steel represented a dependency that foreign powers could exploit. The response was not to avoid dependency, but to build state capacity around its management. The government created centralized import agencies, established rice reserve requirements at the prefectural level, and embedded redundancy into transportation networks. These were not wartime measures. They were foundational features of the modern Japanese state, implemented decades before the phrase total war gained currency. By 1890, Japan had institutionalized the assumption that external supply lines would someday be severed, and that survival required treating scarcity as the default condition rather than the crisis. Slight emphasis on causality. The Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars locked in these structures by demonstrating their necessity. Japan's victories depended not on battlefield superiority, but on logistic systems designed to function under deprivation. The military quartermaster corps, trained to calculate rations in terms of minimum viable nutrition rather than adequacy, became a permanent feature of both civilian and military administration. The Home Ministry adopted caloric intake thresholds as planning benchmarks. Provincial governors were evaluated on their ability to maintain grain stockpiles equivalent to 6 months of local consumption. These practices were not responses to specific threats. They became the inherited grammar of governance. When Japan annexed Korea in 1910 and Manchuria in 1931, it did so not primarily for territorial expansion, but to internalize previously external supply chains. The colonies were not wealth extraction projects in the European model. They were buffer zones against blockade, administrative extensions of the resource management apparatus that had defined the Japanese state since its inception. Pace slightly. Analytical tone. By the 1930s, resource constraint had ceased to be a problem requiring resolution and had become the organizing logic of national planning. The Ministry of Commerce and Industry did not plan for abundance and adapt to scarcity. It planned from scarcity and allocated any surplus toward reserve accumulation. The distinction is not semantic. Western economies treated shortages as disruptions requiring correction. Japan treated adequacy as the disruption. The National Mobilization Law of 1938 formalized powers the government already possessed in practice: rationing authority, price controls, labor conscription, and the redirection of industrial output toward state priorities. These mechanisms were not created by the law. The law codified behaviors already normalized through 2 generations of administrative precedent. When the American embargo on steel and oil took effect in 1941, Japanese planners did not scramble to develop emergency protocols. They activated systems that had been operational since the Meiji period, adjusting ration levels downward within parameters already mapped and tested. Slightly firmer delivery. The illusion of agency appeared in the form of military leadership and the decision to expand into Southeast Asia. To external observers, this appeared as aggression driven by ideology or ambition. Internally, it represented the activation of existing logistical doctrine. The Southern advance was not a gamble. It was the execution of contingency plans written in the 1920s, refined in the 1930s, and rehearsed in staff college exercises for officers who understood that Japan's resource position left no middle option between subordination and autarky. The decision to seize the Dutch East Indies was not made in 1941. It was made implicitly in 1868, when the Meiji government chose industrialization without an indigenous resource base, and explicitly in 1918 when the military codified fuel reserves as a matter of existential national security. Leaders like Tojo did not create the trajectory. They inherited an administrative state in which the only available responses to resource pressure were further expansion or systemic collapse, and collapse was not a choice any governance structure permits itself to make. Transition into wartime execution. The moment of maximum American leverage arrived in early 1945 when Operation Starvation deployed aerial-laid mines across Japan's inland sea and coastal shipping lanes. The campaign achieved tactical success. By April, mine laying had reduced Japanese coastal shipping by 70%. Ports ceased to function. Coal shipments from Hokkaido to Honshu dropped below the threshold required to maintain electrical generation in industrial zones. On paper, the blockade had severed the connections between resource extraction, manufacturing, and population centers. The assumption was that interdiction would cascade into famine, industrial paralysis, and political collapse. It did not. Japan had decentralized food production in the 1930s, relocating rice cultivation targets to suburban plots and establishing municipal vegetable gardens as administrative requirements. Caloric intake fell, but it fell within bands the Home Ministry had already designated as sustainable for periods exceeding 2 years. The population did not starve because the baseline from which rations were calculated had been set deliberately low for decades. What Americans interpreted as desperation was, from the perspective of Japanese administrators, a planned operational mode. Local emphasis. Calm, confident, industrial collapse did not follow because the model of industrial dependency was wrong. American planners assumed that cutting coal and steel shipments would halt weapons production. This assumed that Japanese factories operated on continuous input flow, as American factories did. They did not. Japanese manufacturers had been required since the 1920s to maintain on-site stockpiles sufficient for 3 months of operation without resupply. The Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates were not optimized for efficiency. They were optimized for resilience, a distinction embedded in their Zaibatsu charters and enforced through Ministry of Commerce oversight. When the mines severed shipping, production rates declined, but they declined from artificially high wartime levels toward the sustainable output thresholds around which the entire economy had been calibrated since the Russo-Japanese War. The blockade imposed scarcity. Scarcity was the condition for which the system had been designed. Slow slightly. Conclusive tone. The finalization of the constraint came not from the failure of the blockade, but from its irrelevance to the terms of surrender. Japan did not capitulate because its cities were mined or firebombed, or because its people approached starvation. It capitulated because the Soviet entry into the war eliminated the possibility of a negotiated peace that preserved the imperial system, and because nuclear weapons demonstrated that the United States possessed the means to destroy the state's administrative apparatus faster than it could relocate. The blockade imposed costs, but all costs were bearable if they preserved the system. When the system itself became the target, cost calculations lost meaning. Operation Starvation failed as a strategic instrument not because it was poorly executed, but because it targeted a vulnerability that had been designed out of the Japanese state before anyone involved in the campaign had been born. The American assumption that resource denial could compel surrender was not mistaken in its facts. It was mistaken in its chronology. The question it sought to answer had been resolved in 1868, and no amount of tactical success in 1945 could reopen what 77 years of administrative evolution had closed.